All right, guys, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Jana, Mike, are you guys okay with that?
All set?
All right. Well, first of all, I wanted to welcome everyone. This is part of our series that the GTDC is doing with NPD, talking about tech trends. And Mike Crosby is going to do an overview and look at certain categories and performance in hardware and software. But first, we're just going to go ahead and get started here. Jana, we have Frank is going to introduce and kick off the call. And we're going to talk a little bit about what the GTD's been doing very briefly, some new stuff that we have rolled out. And then, of course, as I said, Mike will go over some data trends. So with that, here's the agenda. We are looking at highs and lows, predictions, emerging trends, return to work impact, what we're seeing out there. And as I mentioned, for those who joined here in the last couple minutes, we are going to pose just a couple of polling questions. Frank first is going to present, and then before Mike comes on, I'm going to ask one quick question, and we'll have a couple more throughout the presentation. So with that, I just want to introduce Frank.
Hey, Kavita, thank you, and welcome everybody. I apologize if my video is a little goofy. I'm actually doing this call from the car. I had to get on the road. I've been so antsy, doing Zoom calls that I've got a dinner tonight that I had to drive down to Tampa for, and so I'm actually mobile, which is a good thing. So welcome and thank you for joining. We're really excited, first of all, to have these calls and continue these calls into 2021. As many of you know, we started them in 2020 with our team from MPD, and obviously, we did it because data and understanding what's happening in the marketplace is always important, but in 2020 it was more important than ever, and we're going to continue that in 2021 and provide you as much information as we can, certainly looking back to some degree so you know what happened, but in our view, more importantly, looking forward to try to get a sense for, what is emerging and what trends we see developing. So we'll do that here shortly. Let me just spend 1 minute telling you a couple of other things we've been doing at GTDC. First is we just released our 2021 outlook, and essentially in that, we talk about the 5 trends that we see as really significant going into 2021. You can see what they are on the right hand side of the slide. I don't have to repeat every one of them, but what's important about them is not only obviously what's happening in each of the areas, but what we try to do with this document is also articulate what we believe the not only distribution's role will be for each of these areas, but the value that distribution brings in each of these areas. So obviously it's from a industry standpoint, but it's also from the standpoint of understanding what distribution is doing in each of the categories. So I would encourage all of you to download it. You can get it off our website and take a look at it. The second item that we've got listed on the chart is a new monthly series that we've created, and we're calling it Did You Know? At one point, we thought about calling it Mythbusters, but we decided we would go with Did You Know? And the purpose of this is to kind of provide facts and information on what's happening in the marketplace, again, from a distribution standpoint. I've found from time to time, there are various people out there in the marketplace, either consultants or analysts or anybody else who thinks they have a forum, which frankly is anybody these days, I guess, because it's easy to have a forum. But I found that there are people out there who provide misleading information, and they talk about things that without a lot of fact. And so what we decided to do was provide facts and provide information relative to what's happening in the marketplace, again, from a distribution standpoint. So we've partnered with NPD in North America and Context and GfK in Europe to get data, to get information, and then provide it to you all in a in a monthly series. So you'll see that roll out shortly. If you have, I think the first one's already out. We're going to have them once a month, and so look for that also. So with that, I'm clearly excited about what we accomplished in 2020, and even more excited about where we're going for 2021. So let me turn it over to Mike Crosby, who will take us through a review of 2020 and then talk about what he sees going forward. Mike, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Frank. Appreciate it. And welcome again to everybody as well. I'm excited to share with you some insights that we have for certainly an interesting 2020. And also we're going to lay out some high level kind of directional commentary around 2021, which I think, again, looking at it's going to be some nice opportunities for growth. So let's start right here with distribution overall with revenue. And again, I think the channel continues to show resilience, even in some pretty difficult conditions. The nice thing is, if you look at this slide, it not only shows a couple things. One is the total top line number, a little north of 70 billion, yes, flat. But if you look at not only the trajectory starting in January, where we saw this continue to ratchet up and to the right as we got to the second half, even in the midst of having some shortages on some key product categories and other things, still a great rally. And then we closed with December a little bit over $8 billion, 10% growth. So again, I think what it really shows is the ability to be agile and flexible and still really provide what's needed, not only on core products, but also broader around solutions. And I think it continues to reinforce Frank's comment around the value proposition that Disti brings. Next slide. Wanted to take a look at this a little bit different cut. This also breaks it down by industry group. You have a sense now on really where the revenue is coming from. And as we continue on through the rest of the deck, we'll continue to get micro a little bit closer on where we are. But a couple of interesting things jump out here. One is on the 70 billion. If you look at the split right now between hardware and software, we've continued to see kind of that allocation begin to distribute more and more to software. Certainly hardware is still the dominant group within the overall mix, but you continue to see software continue to show growth, continue to get broader, and as a little bit more of a balance relative to the overall distribution of the revenue. Next slide. Oops, back up one. So as what we talked about and what Frank had suggested earlier, that we were looking at what are some of the highs and the lows. And I think there were some pretty interesting things. I know it was a little bit lumpy. We had a lot of different changes, a lot of high velocity categories that came out that were relatively light, and areas that used to be very strong saw some pretty good challenge that was going on, predominantly around COVID and the changes that were going on in the marketplace. But a couple of nice ones, I think, are here. Overall hardware blended across all categories, down a couple of percent points. Units were up though, about 6. And again, we know the real impact of work from home and educate from home certainly drove as a huge catalyst for growth, especially on either refresh technology or people trying to think and look at new solutions that ultimately could address what some of the changing environment kind of was contributing. Calling out a couple servers, one was a nice story. I think there were some questions early. Servers were a little bit soft earlier in the year. We did see the rally back, not only on revenue, units flat, but certainly an increase on servers was good to see. We all know the momentum that's been carried forward with notebook and Chromebook specifically, certainly high velocity. I think there was a lot of interesting dynamics that went on there. A lot of it was supply chain driven, where I think there was some real challenges on being able to meet this kind of pivoted demand that really caught a lot of people really depleted. And I think that was a chase that was going on the rest of the year, but certainly great growth, not only on the top line, but also units, as well as tablets. I mean, we certainly see that same momentum in education certainly carried forward a big part of what was going on there. We also see a lot of tablet lift in healthcare. And as people were looking for the opportunity to utilize technology to still adhere to socially distant, but also enable consumers and users to basically function with what they were trying to do, these technologies really helped add a nice bridge to where things were going. Next slide. So where there's areas that are strong, there's also areas counter to that we saw some real challenges. And certainly desktops has been an ongoing challenge. The last positive month that we saw in growth was in March, and the rest has been lagging really consistently through the balance of 2020. Real questions, I think, are post-pandemic, where ultimately does this go? Where does mobility and that flexibility of a mobile solution fit versus a fixed device like a desktop? And where and how, what is the long-term kind of look forward on how and where do desktops really align to kind of the changing dynamics that are going on in the market? So certainly ongoing challenges there. Arrays, we saw kind of an interesting change in the number. We actually saw not only revenue take a pretty good impact, but we certainly saw a rally of units. Relatively speaking, it was a nice lifted number. So a little bit of compression going on pricing, and certainly drove a lot of that. And then lastly, LFCD, I know it's been a little bit of a mixed bag. If you aggregate everything together, certainly with commercial, then you look at hospitality, you've been really badly hit, but interactive whiteboards have actually done very, very well relative to education. And that's kind of the bright spot within that broader category. Next slide. So we touched on software earlier, again, positive growth. A couple things that I saw that jumped out here. Certainly it's about access, it's about management, monitoring specifically, but also security. Security is going to be huge in 2021 and moving forward, certainly with SMB, but even more so with enterprise. Now that we've got large remote workforces that are deployed, a lot of the security protocols were less than 100% when the initial move occurred, because I think the question mark was how long was that going to last? Now with there's a little bit more stay, obviously what we've been doing with work from home or work from anywhere, a lot of these protocols have been optimized and companies are working really aggressively at getting that set up, which is also going to drive some nice top line spend in IT that we're going to talk about here in some future slides. Next slide. OS we'll touch on briefly, but again, I think a lot of this is still tied on a comping year over year, where we saw a big upgrade that went on with Windows 10. And certainly as you look through the balance of these, less focus on BI and database. And you're certainly, again, seeing more, as we touched on earlier, with security. In this particular area, though, content and collaboration, while it's a softer number, I think it's right on the edge. We're seeing that investment and spend accelerate. And we'll begin to see that reflected in the numbers, I believe, as we move into deeper into 2021. Next slide. Cloud continues to be a high flyer, certainly on the infrastructure side, up 30% nearly. And again, if you look, a couple of takeaways on these specifically from a vendor perspective, certainly Amazon continues not only to drive the leader in market share, but also still driving pretty significant growth on a year-over-year basis. What I'm happy about though is not only are the large continue to drive and accelerate, because there's clearly an expanded need for cloud, and certainly post-pandemic, we've seen a lot of data center planned investment and development and growth stalled because of COVID. 2021 should emerge where we've now consumed a lot of that excess capacity that was there. We're getting people back into facilities where they can upgrade or they can develop on new constructions. Certainly look for that to continue to expand, and look for that, I think, to be judged truly now as critical infrastructure. And that's really changed. I think pre-pandemic, I think people understood it, but there were still some questions as to the severity. Now, clearly, it's how we learn, we work, we educate our kids, we entertain. So clearly that infrastructure is a requirement, and certainly we're seeing this cloud infrastructure side of things also become more attractive for certainly not only small business, but also still on the enterprise side. Next slide. Looking within telecommunications, as we break these down each, a couple of areas, and we'd mentioned them earlier around those same initiatives around work from home and educate from home. Certainly huge growth and continued sustained growth seen, because there's still a ongoing demand, and there's, as we work through some of the shortages initially, we still see a strong appetite for additional expansion and growth. What you're also witnessing, not only in this category, but others, are users have gone from what's the basics that I need to be able to function and operate and maintain my productivity, and they're actually looking beyond that now to what's a better overall experience. So we've also seen those ASPs trend upward as people are looking to make some of those improvements. But a couple of jumps that you can see in clear growth: PC headsets with Logitech, Jabra, and Plantronics all pretty significant up into the right growth. And we also see that not only with cellular, which is a little bit softer certainly, but then even with PC microphones as people are building out. And again, looking at what's the broader kind of combination of products and technologies that's going to allow myself not only the best productive self that I can be, but also make sure that it's presenting in a way I think that's it's attractive and it's intuitive. So we're going to continue to see more momentum along those lines. Lastly, another one, as we know, high flyer with webcams. It was a pretty established category. I mean, it was a very modest, very kind of linear growth pattern. Once we saw work from home and educate from home, certainly were big catalysts, but we also saw other initiatives around healthcare. And healthcare with telehealth has become such a huge part of now what is going on. And there are needs and requirements, I think, that were there. And until we got that base educated to a level and a level of comfort, we're now seeing that acceptance pretty broad. But if you look at the numbers overall, the velocity of the category certainly caught a lot of people off guard. It also allowed some other maybe less known players to emerge and really take a bite out of this demand that was there, because there were really challenges from an availability standpoint. And certainly where there was availability, I think people wanted to buy brand and buy spec. But I think as you saw that, at least in the bridge period where there was some lull in inventory, I think it was very spec driven and it was less oriented to the brand. It was about what's available. And I think that's improving, still got some ways to go, but certainly improving along the way. But again, a great story on webcams and continued emergence, not only on the product, but also you're going to see innovation, I believe, kind of get reinfused into this category. You can see nice technology gains. Next slide.
And actually, before we go, Mike, I think this is an opportunity for us to pose a couple of the questions. So the next section is going to be looking ahead into 2021. So I'm going to put up a question here, guys. What do you think the channel growth will be for 2021? If you guys don't mind inputting there. All right, I'm going to end it here. And I'm going to share the results, as you guys can see here. I like how optimistic everybody is and some good projections there.
Love it.
And then I'm going to ask one more question here. This is about data center hardware sales. If you expect the sales to rebound in the second half of 2021. Okay. And that's how that turned out.
Nice.
Okay. Thanks, Mike.
You bet. Awesome. All right. So changing gears a little bit. We've looked at the numbers now, and again, saw some great rally and recovery. Now we want to take just a quick high level as we look at each aspect of kind of moving forward in 2021, starting with supply chain. And I think where we sit currently, I think there's a couple things that at least need to be watched and certainly watched carefully. And I know most of you, clearly this is something that's done, on a regular basis, daily, weekly, as needed. But a couple of points that I want to jump out. The Chinese New Year this year, a little bit different, because I know traditionally you have the ability to bridge with some buffer inventory during that period a little bit, and that typically can sustain you through the end of Chinese New Year and the re-ramp that's coming back up. The challenge is, especially in some of these key categories, we didn't have that buffer to have. So there was already pretty thin inventories across the board, and certainly some questions where, how is this ultimately going to be, especially at the start of the year, new budgets, new other things that are coming out. So something certainly to watch. We also know with Chinese New Year, typically just before it occurs, and this year it's February 12th, Typically the yields come down a little bit where we're seeing personnel changes at the factory. People are departing. There's a lot of uncertainty and that can impact ultimately the ability to get additional product out the door. So it can be a little bit of a headwind. Lastly, we know, manufacturing is certainly going to ramp in March, but it's going to take 30, 45 days to get people stabilized, working, filling, and then ultimately getting it across on the freight side of the equation and get it here to the US. The other challenge, and I think this is something that China and the US are working very closely on now, is what's going on with the freight rates. You guys know it better than anybody right now. Continued port challenges, certainly. We're also seeing pretty good, not only trucker, but also container shortages. On demand capacity is still thin. So I know China and the US are working right now diligently to try and stabilize that a little bit, build in some additional capacity that hopefully can stabilize the rates and ultimately get them down a little bit. But there's certainly some challenges that are unique this year coming off post-COVID than what we had seen in previous years. Next slide. So let's talk kind of macro on budgets overall. And I think it's interesting that you're going to see a big change relative to SMB versus you'll see large and enterprise. But overall, a lot of the budgets in many sectors overall are going to be down mainly because they had lower revenue. I think there's ongoing challenges. It's sector by sector. Some had an absolutely phenomenal year in 2020. Some had an absolutely disastrous year. I think you got a lot of variability there, but some a little bit question marks on where the overall budgets are. What's interesting though is the IT percentage of that budget, especially with larger enterprises, likely to be the same or higher because now they've got larger deployed workforces that are still kind of understanding what are the needs and the requirements on where that needs to go. And certainly, as I mentioned earlier, security is a big critical piece to that. And I think you're going to see that certainly evolve as people are optimizing their model and formalizing what is this hybrid model that it looks to everybody to be leaning towards relative to how do we want to go forward. You're also seeing, as I mentioned earlier, the spend mix. You're continuing to see hardware as a percentage, still a dominant part, but as a percentage still migrate over to software, cloud, and managed services. So you're going to continue to see that balancing and blending over where other companies are taking advantage of some of those other technologies and some of those things that make them more agile and flexible, I think is something that's attractive, specifically around cloud and certainly managed services. Last one on this page, really around the pandemic, all those operational changes that were made through digital transformation, there's a clear driver there and an acceleration that's going on. And again, it's still going to be tied ultimately to maximizing productivity and making sure that they're as efficient and secure as possible in supporting the remote workforce. Next slide. So let's pare down to each of these individual groups and we can talk about just 2 or 3 key points that I think are relative. We've seen it, we've experienced it locally on the challenges that have gone on with SMB. We know it's a huge part of the economy, but it's also been really under the gun financially. They also have clearly less operational flexibility than larger companies do. So there's been an ongoing concern of just, can I stay in business and operate? So this year really is going to be about stabilization and ultimately the recovery. And I think it's going to come part and parcel really to the additional funding that's going to be made available through the new administration, because critically, small business is really what's going to drive, I think, that accelerated part. It also drives significant part of the employment. Expectations for small business, from my perspective, it's likely going to be less overall. Again, they're very much down to what I need, what's critical. It's not going to be a nice to have. It's going to be what's a must have. That focus is going to be maintained really on the core hardware they need to refresh. You're also going to see small business continue to try and focus core on what their own value proposition is. And if it's not their core competency, they'll look to third-party managed services to augment that, where they can keep their people focused on what it is that they do and do well, utilize a cost and scalability of third party, and similarly looking at cloud where they can get that flexibility and scale and certainly cost improvement that makes a big difference. Hardware's focused on laptops. We touched earlier on desktops. Servers are interesting because we did see the lift in servers, but it's going to be interesting where that aligns to small businesses. They're starting to see cloud-based infrastructure become that other option as they get more educated and I think understanding of what the capabilities are and the flexibility. Next slide. So let's pivot to large enterprise. Again, we've touched on it briefly. Budgets by indications that in talking with people and additional research, likely to either be the same or increase of last year. As I've mentioned, it's all about making sure, do we have our remote-based workforce set up correctly, set up for success? Are they optimized where they can scale efficiently and effectively? And do we have comfort in the security protocols we have in place to ensure that it's protecting our business overall? Certainly hardware is going to continue on laptops and tablets. I've mentioned security, that's going to be critical. And the focus really around software, now you'll see even more so around that general productivity along with security and making sure, again, that we're able to do the things that are needed, but at the same time, doing it in a way that's as efficient and secure as we can. Certainly continue to see cloud and migrate over, other than the fact where we have confidentiality issues tied to HIPAA, maybe within healthcare, other financial, but the rest of it, we continue to see that momentum move forward on cloud. Next slide. Moving to education has been interesting, and I think with the change now in administration, it's made I think a difficult situation appear to be a little bit better. On the second round of funding that was approved, there was 82 billion set aside for education versus the 200 billion that was requested. And again, just to reiterate, the majority of the funding for K-12 really comes from tax revenues from states and cities. So ultimately, with most of the economy in a lot of areas shut down, there was going to be a gap. And because states can't operate in a deficit, the bridge has to come from the federal government. So I think with the changes made now, I think there's going to be more likelihood that we're going to continue to see this ongoing momentum because there's support around what needs to be done financially. Certainly in areas like California and some of the other larger states, they utilized a lot of deferrals on education spend. So they basically spent this year's budget last year, and that was all coming due. So part of where that's going to make a real difference is enabling them to continue to bridge specifically that technology gap that's still significant here within the US. We saw the momentum around Chromebooks, laptops, tablets, and as I mentioned, interactive whiteboards have been just a huge success and continue to show really strong momentum and utilization of some of these new technologies. Then lastly, on software, it's going to be all about certainly productivity and communication, but it's also about security. There was more issues, just like within healthcare, as they had with school districts, with ransomware and other challenges. And I think there's a real inward looking that's going on right now to make sure that they've got secure and scalable kind of systems in place to ensure that they can continue to operate, because there's a lot of weight now that's put on utilizing the technology that's in place today. And I think security, again, can't be overemphasized. It's something that's really critical. Next thing. And looking at higher ed, similar story. The allocation, 23 billion for higher ed. The challenge has been, again, not only with the lower tax revenues, but as we've mentioned, enrollment was actually down as well. Here's where I think higher education really has a real opportunity to move even faster than K-12. I think you're going to look for higher ed to embrace more the integration of the in-person digital versus maybe kind of it was a stopgap, it was a bridge, and we go back to the way they were. I think most educators are saying brick and mortar education with large campuses and the costs and the spiraling up costs of the pandemic makes some of these things just unattainable. So I think they're looking at what are ways that we can integrate some of this digital technology now and make it core to the way that we want to educate students moving forward, not only provide scalability and cost improvement, but also protection in the event that there's another issue tied to a pandemic, as an example. Next slide.
Yeah,
And I'm going to turn this over to you. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Kavita, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, we do have a poll question around that too. Let me go ahead and do that. So when the employees, your employees and your coworkers return to the office, what type of environment are you expecting? 3 options there. All right, I'm going to end it here. Yeah, overwhelmingly, we're looking at the hybrid model. We posed the same question to our European teams, and the responses were very much matched up with what we're seeing here.
Very consistent.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
All right.
I'm going to turn it over to Jana now that she's going to talk a little bit about that specific topic, return to workplace, and some interesting data that we've got surrounding that. Jana?
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Kavita. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about some different kind of research that NPD has available. It's in our return to workplace information. We've actually been tracking cell phone GPS data for quite some time. And before COVID hit, we were tracking when people traveled, when they went into work, and how did that impact look after COVID hit. And if you take a look at this trend, of course, you can see end of March, dramatic decline in those people going to work. And you also see some changes around the holiday time periods when things go up and down. You might be asking yourself, okay, well, what does this matter? How does this matter to distribution? And there's actually a great point I'm trying to get here for you guys. Not only do we look at it across the United States, but we're able to look at it by region and by city, DMA. And when we dove into those, I wanted to show you that the overall trend of when people are going to work and actually returning to work, we do see a change in distribution sales. As people go into work, sales increase. It just shows how it's related as, you know, we need people back to work. Industries open up, retail opens up, food industries open up, even if it might be quick service. You know, they are looking for additional technologies to support that. So as we work through this pandemic and through 2021, there's going to be key segments, not only verticals, cities, marketplaces, or industries to focus on. The GPS data has allowed us to see some of that transformation. So what categories or what part of the market has been impacted? And of course, it has been digital transformation. And the last year, it's really been driven by cloud, security, mobility, and integrated systems. And Mike really showed the results in his data as well. But if we were to take this a little bit further, one step down, what segments really performed well, and what areas of the market? And Mike hit home again in this, and where we're going to see growth. If we were to take a look at cloud, for 2020, it was really enterprise, retail, and SMB markets that showed year-over-year revenue growth. And then the vendors that were really leading, of course, it was Amazon Web Services and IBM within these three segments for digital transformation. For mobility, it was public sector, e-commerce, and SMB. The vendors that really drove here. For public sector, we saw Acer and Samsung performing really well with triple-digit year-over-year revenue growth. In e-commerce, I wanted to point out Lenovo, Asus, and MSI. MSI is traditionally focused on gaming, which I thought that was interesting for us to see more of a gaming push going through e-commerce, which also makes sense. And then for the SMB customer, Acer, Lenovo, and HP also having double and triple digit year-over-year revenue growth, servicing that segment of the market through distribution. Now, for our integrated systems, really the two vendors that drove home in the enterprise, public sector, and SMB space were Lenovo and Dell, both of them performing double and triple digit year-over-year revenue growth rates with their systems servicing these customer segments. And lastly, security. We know security was a focus in 2020, and it will continue to be a focus in 2021. Where we saw growth with the global consulting organizations was Palo Alto and Blue Coat, over 1,000% growth for both of those two vendors servicing this customer segment. In public sector, it was Palo Alto and McAfee. And then lastly, rounding out the enterprise segment, we had multiple vendors here with double and triple digit growth, including Checkpoint, Commvault, Infoblox, and Sonic Wall, all performing really well, servicing that enterprise segment. I just wanted to provide just additional layer to Mike's data and really hit home that as certain markets are returning back to work, we'll continue to see some of these digital transformation technologies grow and by various customer segments. So that rounds out our presentation for today. Kavita and I are here to answer any questions for you, as well as Mike or Frank. We will send out the slide deck after the call today.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, absolutely submit them in via chat, or you can ask them right now, or even post the webinar. If there's certain areas that you find beneficial that were covered, any other content that you would like to see explored a little bit more. And if you have any general questions about the data or even what the GTDC has been doing and publishing. I do have one final question here, which is really about the webinars. You know, if you guys have any preference on how frequently we do them. Right now we're averaging, you know, somewhere between quarterly and 6 to 8 weeks, somewhere in between that time frame. But if you guys, you know, would like to see it a little bit more frequently, or if you're fine with the cadence, we'd appreciate you talk to that as you guys submit in your questions. And as these come in, there is a question, Jana, here. Does return to work refer to employment or back to the office?
Back to the office. Great question, David. Thank you.
All right. So yeah, so as we can see here, Jana, it's pretty much, it's almost tied really. But we'll get back to you guys on, you know, what the next dates are for it, and what any feedback that we get from you guys regarding this webinar series. Jana, Mike, I don't know if you guys had any closing thoughts here or.
Just a couple. I think, again, just to reiterate, I think 2021 sets the stage for a really nice opportunity. Mainly, again, we're seeing a lot of momentum built in the second half, but I think it's an exciting time to be in IT specifically, because I think we've shown with a pandemic how IT really helped bridge and accelerate a lot of the ways that we can work and educate our kids, et cetera. And I think there's going to be a ton of accelerated change coming our way. And I think we're all positioned very well to address that.
All right. Does anybody have any questions or anything additional before we close out here? Well, I want to thank everyone for making the time and attending the webinar. And again, we're here, Jana and I and the rest of the team, if you guys have any questions or need any additional information. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day.
Bye.